Today on BRStv, we explore the next component of the Brs WWC Hybrid System with major, minor, and trace elements. Implemented here on both the Red Sea Reefer XXL 750, smaller all-in-one Red Sea E Series 170, and the BRS 160, and then giving away a Vertex Calcium Reactor at the end. Hey, I'm Ryan, your host of BRStv. This week we have episode 13 in the Brs WWC Hybrid System. In this series, we're developing a method of dealing with almost every major reefing topic and assembling them all into one cohesive system that, above all else, is simple and stable. This hybrid system will also address a variety of budgets and skill levels almost anyone can follow and expect to achieve very similar results. Hopefully exploring these methods in a manner where, regardless of experience level in the hobby, learn something new, or use WWC and BRS teams' experiences to refine our knowledge. In this series, we're going to explore what we believe to be the 8 core components of a successful reefing system: filtration, lighting, flow, the cycle, chemistry, coral nutrition, husbandry, and the maintenance rhythm. In that spirit, we're talking about major, minor, and trace elements all day today. This might seem simple to most, and it really isn't that difficult, but there is a lot of debate about this type of thing, which method is best, easiest, cheapest, and so on, all with their own fans. Today we won't be able to identify what's best for everyone because that's a mythical creature, but we can provide you the information so you can decide what is best for your needs or desires, as well as document this component of the hybrid series in a clear path for anyone to follow who wants to achieve the same results as the WWC tanks and get what we're going to produce here. First question we always answer in all this is, what can you expect by doing this well? Meaning, if you implement the best major, minor, and trace element solution for your situation. Well, I'm just going to keep it simple. Done well, the water in your tank will be elementally similar to natural seawater. I say similar because it doesn't need to be perfect, and attempting to be perfect can often cause more issues than it solves. More important than perfect is close, meaning that nothing is dramatically elevated or depleted, and even more important, stable. Corals are amazingly adaptive organisms if you just give them a chance. However, if their environment is constantly changing, they will be stressed and it will show in the results. Stressed corals, either because an element is severely depleted or elevated, or because things are constantly changing, just don't show their best color. In fact, often brown out. Stressed out corals also grow very slowly, have limited polyp extension, tissue loss, and in the worst cases, even mortality. Converse of that is, if you do this right, expect better coloration, better growth, better polyp extension, tissue health, and reduced mortality. Okay, so with that goal in mind, I always like to look at this first from an angle of what almost everyone universally agrees on. By that, I mean like 9 out of 10 reefers, understanding there's always a mix of documented proven items, research, and well understood or accepted theory. So in that spirit, almost everyone agrees that major elements like calcium and alkalinity are the most important to get right because they're the most rapidly consumed and the most significant component of the coral's calcification process. So calcium and alkalinity do need to be replaced, and you do need to find a method that matches calcium and alkalinity uptake to calcium and alkalinity input. At this point, nearly everyone agrees that of these two, alkalinity is the most important, and that's because there's in the neighborhood of 7 times as much calcium in the water as alkalinity. That means 2 things. First, available alkalinity is just depleted much faster, but it also means since they're consumed together in equal amounts, overall calcium and alkalinity consumption is easier to test for with alkalinity. That's because a drop of, say, 1 DKH from 8 to 7 should have the equivalent drop in calcium from like 420 to 413, which really isn't even measurable with most hobby-grade test kits. In fact, a drop of an alkalinity of 2 DKH from 8 to 6, most long-term reefers would say is pretty dramatic, but the equivalent drop in calcium from 420 to 406 is right on the edge of what most hobby-grade calcium test kits can report accurately. So in the end, both are important, but most reefers consider alkalinity to be the most important to track closely and the best window into the consumption of both. Closely related to that, 9 out of 10 experienced reefers also believe monitoring and replenishing magnesium is an important component of maintaining overall chemistry by helping prevent calcium and alkalinity from precipitating out, as well as strongly believed to be an important component of metabolic function for corals. In relation to minor and trace elements, there isn't a whole lot which is universally agreed upon, but I will say 9 out of 10 reefers would likely agree that you can have a pretty darn successful reef tank without ever thinking about minor and trace elements once. Double so if you have a decent water change schedule with a decent salt mix. Water changes are just an acceptable strategy to maintain difficult to test for and dose elements. Trace and minor elements will likely be depleted to some degree, but not in a manner which will prevent success. However, outside of that, I think we can all agree that corals, just like any other animal, can live pretty long lives in a nutritionally deficient environment. Even though it doesn't show itself in anything as drastic as immediate mortality, there are benefits to putting effort into providing a proper nutritive diet or environment, and I think that's true of almost any pet that you could take care of. While the role of every last element isn't fully understood, if it's actively being depleted below typical ocean values in the reef tank, it's likely there are metabolic health benefits to replenishing many of them, even if it isn't absolutely required for basic survival. So in the end, I think it's nearly universally agreed that corals are likely to see some type of benefits from maintaining minor and trace elements, but the debate comes in as to which ones are biologically beneficial and to what degree, and is it worth the effort. The answer to that will be different for each reefer. Related to that, this isn't universally agreed upon, but I bet at least 8 out of 10 3-year-plus reefers will say don't dose any elements that you're not going to test for, because uncontrolled dosing is much more likely to result in issues than solve them, especially long-term cumulative issues. I think that's less true with minor and trace element solutions designed to work directly with calcium uptake or part of a 2-part additive system, but I don't think most people would dose an uncontrolled amount of any element or bottle of trace element deluxe. However, today we can actually get a window into all that with all of the ICP testing available, so regardless of what method or mentality you use, you can send in a test once or twice a year and see if what you're doing is way off or pretty darn close to natural seawater. I personally wouldn't suggest using the ICP test to play mad scientist and start dosing all kinds of individual elements, but I might consider a couple if I thought that they were important. More so, I'd use the ICP testing to identify if my general approach to reefing and solutions that I've chosen are working and hopefully catch issues before they show themselves as real problems in the reef tank. It might even be as simple as upping the water change schedule a bit or change the approach to maintaining elements. Another undebatable fact is that changes in salinity changes the concentration and availability of every single element in the tank. It's not uncommon for newer reefers to let the tank evaporate a gallon a day or so and then replace it once a week, which means the entire tank is getting more concentrated throughout the week and then suddenly drops back down when you replace the fresh water. For example, Red Sea states when their blue bucket salt is mixed at 30 parts per thousand, you can expect a calcium as low as 355 to 385, but when mixed just 5 points higher, it's 415 to 445. Replacing evaporated water in a timely fashion is just critical. That leads right into the next one, which is almost every long-term successful reefer will share. It's less about selecting the perfect levels and more about stable levels. Stability is much more likely to produce results than almost anything else. Again, corals will adapt to almost any environment, but only if you let them. If the parameters are constantly changing, it will show in poor results. Triple so with sensitive species like SPS show tanks. Okay, moving on to some of the more debatable items related to major, minor, and trace elements. Debate not really being if all this is accurate, but more so how this information applies to your needs and the debate of what is the best solution for you. There are 4 popular ways to maintain major, minor, and trace elements with an SPS-only tank, all of which are endlessly debated. Calcium reactors, Kalkwasser 2 parts, and now 1 parts. The debate is almost always trying to find that mythical best option, and there absolutely is a best option, but not a universal best, so don't let anyone tell you what the best is unless they're really willing to listen to your particular needs. Open and honest, I think the search for the best messes up more people than it helps. Better than best is just a good option that will reliably meet your needs, simple, stable, affordable, and effective. So again, the 4 main options are calcium reactors, Kalkwasser 2 parts, and more recently 1 parts like Tropic Marin's Carville calcium. Since we're talking specific about SPS tanks here, I'm just going to share the pros and cons for all of these specific to an SPS show tank. Let you decide for yourself or use this as a touch point for information to ask additional questions. But we will make a very direct recommendation at the end as part of the hybrid series where WWC and BRS's successes intersect. Most of you are already pretty familiar with these methods, and I will try to keep the discussion focused on the points that matter most. I'm going to start with calcium reactors because that's what you'll find in all the WWC show tanks. Some also run Kalkwasser in conjunction, but they all run calcium reactors. For those who don't know, this doesn't get any more straightforward. A calcium reactor is just a cylinder that uses carbon dioxide to essentially melt old coral skeleton into all of its base elements or ions, and then a liquid that is dosed to the tank for new corals to use for their growth. Old coral, reborn into new coral, both simple to understand and certainly a cool factor as well. I guess I'm going to start with the cons of a calcium reactor. Number one, a calcium reactor ranges from somewhat costly to very expensive. The reactor itself is often only a couple to a few $100, but once you add in the various quality CO2 regulators, canisters, pH controllers, and feed pumps, this can easily be a cool grand invested in the solution. And to be frank, this is one area where higher quality options offer dramatic improvements in ease of operation, reliability, and related results. So I think it is wise for most reefers to consider the best overall results and solutions will be at the higher end of the cost spectrum. Related to all that is complexity. If you just heard CO2 regulator, pH controller, feed pump options, and tuning and thought that sounds really complex, you're amongst the majority, and there's a learning curve to this for sure. But I will say that that's gotten a lot easier in the last few years. And they're now tuning approaches which are as simple as adjusting the flow rate or turning a knob on a single feed pump. Faster means more calcium and alkalinity, slower means less. As long as you can turn a knob and understand that faster means more and slower means less, I think this is a concept that almost anyone can follow. While ongoing tuning and operation can be that simple, the setup takes a bit more thought, but I am comfortable saying that anyone who's at the point of considering an SPS show tank and willing to make this kind of investment is very likely beyond the knowledge set required for something as simple as a calcium reactor. But it isn't as brainless as just telling a dosing pump to dose 50 milliliters of 2-part a day. I will also note that more equipment means more maintenance. You'll have to periodically monitor the pump flow rate, pH probe accuracy, replace the media, and exchange CO2 canisters, most of which I'd call quarterly maintenance, but it's more stuff that needs to be done and monitored. A calcium reactor's effluent, which is dosed to the tank, is also inherently lower pH in the tank itself, so it will lower the pH of the tank to some degree. There are a variety of ways to mitigate that with the refugium or CO2 scrubber or Kalkwasser, but without them, I would anticipate the pH being 1/10 of a point or two lower overall. Each install, however, is a bit different. Lastly, space. Not everyone has room under their stand or in their sump for a calcium reactor and CO2 canister, so it might not be an option to install based on space alone. 2 parts and such just take up way less space. Okay, so what are the pros and why would anyone run a calcium reactor? Well, there are functional advantages we'll hit on in a second. If we're being honest, the number one pro is probably just cool factor, and the gear junkie in many of us, there's no way around it. Running a calcium reactor and the concepts behind it are just cool and a fun extension of the hobby. I'd say this is pretty similar to the LED lighting versus T5 debate. T5 fluorescent lighting is dramatically cheaper, and in a whole slew of ways, a lot easier to achieve success with, particularly with medium to large SPS colonies. But there's a cool factor with LEDs and a few advantages which make them near irresistible to a majority of reefers out there. Same thing with the calcium reactor. There's a cool factor here that just isn't there with a jug of 2-part, and some advantages that make the calcium reactor irresistible to many reefers. So what are the more legit or functional advantages? Well, I think number one is automatic replenishment of trace elements. Because you are melting coral skeleton down into its original components, it's reasonable to believe that most elements that are directly related to calcification are also being melted and being added back to the tank in proportion to how they were uptaken by the coral. I will say that trace element benefit is more of a strongly believed and plausible theory than it is clearly demonstrated fact. And it isn't clear which trace elements are added, and it's likely each brand or type of calcium reactor media adds different elements. And it's also likely the elements that are utilized by the soft tissue of the coral are either not present or in smaller amounts. I will say 2 things in relation to that. First, you should absolutely expect a whole series of BRStv Investigates episodes that looks deeper into what each media actually doses once these tanks are up and running and we have the time for more Investigates. Second, the 3 WWC show tanks that we shared at the start of this series manage major, minor, and trace elements with calcium reactors and a 10 to 15% weekly water change. Their method has been proven and replicated on multiple tanks at this point. So if you look at this kind of success and say, yep, I'd be happy with that, then a calcium reactor and a decent water change schedule are more than likely an adequate solution to overall element replenishment. I would note that bound up in the coral skeleton is probably also some undesirable elements like small amounts of phosphate or even other contaminants, so melting these likely will also add that to your tank as well. I chalk this up to a benefit in my book because the fact is every method of calcium and alkalinity addition is going to have some contaminants. Something you got to see in the series we did on ICP analysis of many 2-part options. However, presumably with calcium media made up of coral, whatever's in the skeleton is only going to be released as fast as an equivalent amount of new coral skeletal structures being grown in the tank. I mean, it's very plausible that the contaminants won't be added any faster than was tolerable to the original coral grown in the ocean environment. That just can't be said about salts and minerals in two parts, which have been mined from the ground or concentrated in outdoor evaporation ponds. With those, it's 100% about the level of processing afterwards. Another nice thing about a dialed-in calcium reactor is stability. They generally offer a very stable and controlled amount of calcium and alkalinity every day, and one of the only options which is providing it 24/7, all day, every day. Related to stability, the solution is also inherently balanced, means adding near equal amounts of calcium and alkalinity, and for the most part, should keep both calcium and alkalinity stable and in balance in the tank, with likely only the most subtle adjustments. The last two significant benefits with the calcium reactor are the media has no effect on salinity, chloride, or sodium levels like two parts that rely on salts do. And second, on a rather large tank, calcium reactors can be the most cost-effective long-term solutions. I've seen many attempts at trying to quantify when the tank has a high enough consumption rate to justify the change, and I'll just say I think they're all skewed to produce the desired outcome. For example, this is largely based on the type of gear used, and most of the equations don't factor in equipment replacement. Pumps and such do wear out over time. Straight up, unless you have a rather large tank with super high consumption or go with a bare bones setup, the reactor may not be the lowest cost solution, so I'd consider the other benefits as a primary factor in your decision. Next up is two-part additives, which is probably the #1 calcium and alkalinity solution for reef tanks. And I'd say maybe 80% or more of show tanks are running two-part of some sort. When I say two-part, they can be 3, 4, or even 7 parts, but reefers commonly refer to all of them as two parts. Again, I think I'll start with the cons. I think there are 3 major ones. The most significant is they're not perfect chemistry solutions because most are based on salts like calcium chloride and something like sodium carbonate or bicarbonate. I mean, they'll all result in excess sodium and chloride in the tank, and you'll have to correct for that with a decent water change schedule or similar water exchange solution. Second, there are a variety of ways all two parts approach minor and trace elements, and most of them are less than ideal, but almost all of them are what I'd call adequate and something that we'll get to in a moment. Relay to that, most of them are just a one-size-fits-all approach, meaning they don't really know your tank and don't consider factors like what corals you have or do you run a refugium or not. There are exceptions like Triton, which has the Triton method formula, which is basically just a 4-part formulated for use with a refugium and includes the elements a refugium consumes, and the Triton other methods, which is just a 4-part for use with tanks that don't run a refugium. So there are some tailored to your system, but they're kind of rare. Lastly, one is not as good as the next in terms of their approach to elements, overall quality or impurities, and cost to use, so it can be pretty hard for the average reefer to pick the one that best matches their needs. All of these issues are magnified with an SPS show tank where consumption or depletion of elements is pretty rapid, also meaning potential impurities will build up faster, and the larger doses have corresponding impact on the overall monthly cost of the selection. Okay, so what about the pros with two parts? There are some significant advantages with common two parts, starting with simple and stable, meaning adding calcium and alkalinity is often as easy as adding equal amounts of each fluid, something that any reefer of any skill level can do successfully. Related to that, there are easy calculators out there for many two parts which help calculate the exact dose, and it doesn't get much easier. It's also stable because once you identify the amount your tank consumes in a day, you just add that amount daily, often spread out over the day, creating a very stable parameter in the tank. Ease of use and stability are often very closely tied together. That also means automation is super easy because all you need to do to make daily additions automatically and remove nearly all the work is a couple dosing pumps set up to dose the amount of calcium and alkalinity your tank needs, and equally easy to adjust up or down. I'll also say using today's common equipment, two-part is probably the safest automated solution out there, meaning the dosing pumps are the least likely pieces of equipment to catastrophically fail in your system. While they sometimes fail off and the motor or tubing fails, it's pretty rare for them to get stuck in the on position and overdose, which is the main concern. I mean, the goal here isn't a 2-year tank, but a 10-year plus tank, so safety and reliability of the approach is a critical factor to long-term success. Another advantage of the two parts is the most popular ones have a pretty significant increase to the tank's pH when using them, which most reefers find desirable. Two parts also have pretty minimal maintenance, meaning all you need to do is fill the jugs now and then, but for most people, the gallon-sized jugs often last a month or so. If you have the space, you can use very large containers like 5-gallon buckets with a tight-fitting lid and go even longer. And lastly, two-part can be one of the more affordable methods of maintaining calcium and alkalinity, both in terms of the actual two-part, but also the equipment required to do it safely. But this kind of depends on which one you select. For that reason, two parts can readily be scaled to almost any size tank. The only thing that changes is the size of the dosing vessel and the amount dosed. In the spirit of discussing the pros and cons of two-part, I think we have to talk about some of the more popular two-parts out there because it's again endlessly debated as to which ones are best. In my mind, it comes all down to cost, their approach to minor and trace elements, and the amount of work each approach adds. The most common two-part option players being ESV, Red Sea, Triton, Tropic Marin, and BRS. Starting with ESV, which is one of the originals, a true two-part which comes in 2 jugs with some of the minor and trace elements mixed in, and about 34 bucks for 2 gallons, or in larger sizes about 22 bucks for a set of 2 gallons. Biggest benefit here is a two-part approach is just a lot easier. Only requires 2 pumps and probably one of the most time-tested options out there. Only real con here is there's only so many trace elements you can mix into the 2 parts without precipitation issues, so there are fewer elements that are addressed with true 2-part approach, but the affordability and ease of use factors here probably outweigh that for many reefers. Next up is Triton, which is a 4-part, 1 calcium, 1 magnesium, and 2 alkalinity solutions. All have the minor and trace elements mixed in. The 4-part approach allows them to add a wider breadth of trace and minor elements without precipitation issues. And then they sell ICP test kits, which add accountability and legitimacy to their approach. That said, the 4-part costs around 50 bucks for a set of a liter of each solution. The 4-part solution is more concentrated, and because there are 2 alkalinity portions, it will last from around 3 to 7 times as long as other 2 parts. So what does cost more, it really isn't apples to apples. Next is Red Sea. Arguably, their approach has the potential to be the most inclusive of all of them out there because the Red Sea approach is a 3-part calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium solution, but then coupled with their trace colors program, which has all the minor and trace elements in the 4 separate bottles, based on maintaining 31 trace and minor elements without precipitation or other issues. Well, it's very likely this is amongst the most inclusive approach to this. It does come with a cost of buying all 7 components, and because that probably has the highest ongoing cost associated with that, I also say that 7 components is a lot to dose and more bottles than some may want to maintain. Then we have Tropic Marin's balling light method, which is also one of the original 2 parts out there. In this case, they have a 3-part approach, which is pretty clearly labeled as calcium chloride in part A, sodium carbonate and bicarbonate in part B, and part C is what they call sodium chloride-free salt, which they could probably be clearer. The sodium chloride-free salt is just everything in saltwater other than sodium chloride, calcium, and alkalinity, meaning most of the other major, minor, and trace elements in seawater. Together, all 3, A, B, and C, essentially make up a well-balanced saltwater for your tank. After concentration is considered at about 38 bucks for 2.2 pounds of the 3 materials, which mix up to make about 2.5 gallons of calcium and alkalinity solutions, I think it's about the same cost as some of the more affordable 2-part options out there as well. And lastly, we have the Brs Pharma 2-part, which is really a 3-part as well with calcium, alkalinity, and magnesium solutions, but does not attempt to address minor or trace elements. Brs Pharma is also produced using pharmaceutical-grade raw materials and meets those strict standards, but sold in bulk, so it's as little as 4 bucks per gallon of calcium and alkalinity solution. I feel confident in sharing that this is where the highest quality meets the most affordable, which certainly represents value. But what about trace and minor element replenishment? Well, historically, the most common approach was just a decent water change schedule with salt of reasonable quality. Well, ironically not perfect, this approach has proven to be more than adequate for 80% of the tanks out there, which are softy, polyps, LPS, mixed tanks, and even some SPS dominant tanks. Certainly the most popular option that we offer simply due to the low cost and high quality standards. That said, many reefers do want to properly maintain minor and trace elements with an approach that goes beyond just water changes. To do that, the BRS Red Sea Hybrid or BRS Tropic Marin Hybrid solutions are probably the best approaches. Just like BRS, both Red Sea and Tropic Marin are predominantly based on calcium chloride and sodium carbonate or bicarbonate for the calcium and alkalinity, and then dose minor or trace elements separately. With Red Sea, the 4-part trace element components are dosed in direct relation to the calcium uptake or amount dosed. Randy did a whole video on the BRS Red Sea Hybrid method you can watch, but in a nutshell, for every 51 milliliters of BRS 2-part, you dose 1 milliliter of each of the 4 trace colors. This achieves most of the net benefits from the more advanced approach, but with BRS pharma quality and a much more affordable price point. The BRS Tropic Marin hybrid method is similar, but really probably easier because it's just one additional solution to dose, and it's dosed in the exact amount as the calcium and alkalinity portions of BRS 2-part. To make the third solution to match BRS 2-part concentrations, it's 168 grams or 7.5 scoops of their Part C to make a gallon of solution. I think this solution is going to be pretty attractive to a lot of reefers because it's so easy to understand and implement, better than 2-part alone, and affordable at about $3 a gallon for Part C, so the results don't have to be miraculous to be justified. Okay, moving on to the pros and cons of Kalkwasser. Kalkwasser is really one of the favorite solutions for most softy, polyp, LPS, and even mixed tanks, but I'm going to keep this kind of short and sweet because most reefers will not attempt to produce a wall-to-wall SPS show tank with Kalkwasser alone. It can be done, there are just some challenges. Kalkwasser is actually capable of some pretty impressive tanks, and coupled with high evaporations and solutions like vinegar, it can add a lot of calcium and alkalinity, but as I mentioned, there are just some challenges. Again, I'll start with those cons. Kalkwasser solution has a very low concentration of calcium and alkalinity, so you often need to dose a half a gallon to 1 or more gallons of saturated calc solution a day with an SPS dominant tank. The amount you can dose strictly limited by the amount of water your tank evaporates, which can change with the seasons, so it's not always the most stable solution. In relation to that, if you add too much calc solution, the pH can get undesirably high, particularly when incorporated with other CO2 uptake methods like a refugium, because it does have a significant impact on pH. Overdoses are much more dangerous to the tank. Most tanks can handle overdoses of 2-part, but calc can wipe out the tank pretty easily if you don't implement a solid redundancy or precautions. In BRS Investigates, we also found that other than the BRS Pharma, which performed well, many of the Kalkwasser options out there also had some purity issues with pretty substantial levels of aluminum in the hundreds of parts per million, silica in the thousands, significant phosphate, and 20 or so parts per million heavy metals. Most or even nearly all of that likely precipitates out, but it's likely important to make sure that you don't dose any of what settles out to the tank. This is particularly important with more sensitive corals like SPS, where there's also a pretty huge investment into stocking the tank. Okay, so what about the pros of Kalkwasser? Well, it's probably the most affordable option out there. Calcium hydroxide is just inexpensive. It's also a balanced approach, which adds both calcium and alkalinity in equal amounts with a single liquid. Kalkwasser solution also has almost no effect on salinity because there's no sodium or chloride. And calc solution also raises the pH of the tank, which almost everyone finds desirable, and coupled with an auto top-off can solve pH, calcium, alkalinity, salinity, and evaporation in a single solution, which is awesome. Overall, I really like Kalkwasser for many tanks, but you just won't see me suggest it for a wall-to-wall SPS show tank, not because it can't be done, just because other solutions are probably better on very high-demand tanks. The last method of element replenishment is Tropic Marine's carbocalcium and alpha reef, which are both 1-part solutions based off calcium formate. This is relatively new, but Zach has been using the alpha reef on his SPS tank for many months now, and I've been using it on the softy, polyp, and LPS ULMs for a couple of months now as well. More or less, when you dose the calcium formate to the tank, the calcium is ionized and goes off in the tank, and the formate is actually metabolized by the bacteria in the tank into alkalinity. It's a pretty interesting approach. So starting with the cons, I only have a few. First, even though it's working for us, it's a newer solution, so I'm pretty far from recommending it in a series based on a track record of success like this one. Using new products or a solution like this makes you somewhat of a trailblazer. It's important to recognize that. Second, because the alkalinity needs to be metabolized by the bacteria to become available, it isn't instantly available, and the process consumes some oxygen in the tank, so there's a max to the amount you want to dose to the tank. They generally say up to a medium demand tank, but everyone's version of a medium demand is a bit different. I'll just say that I'm happy with it and it's perfect fit for a ULM or ultra low maintenance tank. Zach's also using the alpha reef effectively with his tank and happy with the results, but dosing more than the suggested maximum to achieve it. In the end, if you look at Zach's tank and it's close to what you want to achieve in coral type and density, I'd call this about the max that I'd use for carbocalcium or alpha reef. I'll just say it isn't the cheapest method out there, so it might not be a currently economically viable option for super large, high-demand tanks. So what are the pros of the carbocalcium? Well, some are pretty obvious. It's just a single solution, and one version even has trace elements in it. That means only buy one thing to dose, and automation is just a single dosing pump. I know that's going to be super attractive to a lot of reefers. Like Kalkwasser, there's no effect on salinity because there's no excess chloride or sodium, but unlike Kalkwasser, it's highly concentrated, so you can dissolve a lot into a single gallon of water and make concentrations similar to standard 2 parts. You don't have the same immediate risks associated with pH and overdosing, but that may be traded out with some less immediate impacts on oxygen in case of an overdose. In the end, I think you're actually going to see a lot of reefers migrating over to this 1-part approach, but how fast that happens will likely be based on how many trailblazers there are and the reported successes and challenges. Okay, so all the pros and cons on calcium reactors, 2 parts Kalkwasser and 1 parts like carbo-calcium are absolutely 100% debatable, and even more so, which one is right for you is a debate that also includes your individual needs. But more debatable than that is what calcium and alkalinity level do you maintain yourself in the mythical hunt for what's best. So we're going to have a direct recommendation at the end of all this, but I'm just going to skip the debate because I've seen reefers successful in a wide range of parameters. Most of what's shared is anecdotal and often not universally repeatable or agreed on with no clear winner. So I'll just say that my end of the debate is stay away from the extremes and you'll be okay. Before we move on to sharing WWC's direct approach to all this and the hybrid method, I have 2 last things the reefing community debates endlessly, and that's testing methods, which test kit is best, and does ICP testing have any value? To the first part, I'll just share that we need to have reasonable expectations for the test kits. These are all hobby-grade tools with associated price points, and I'll be frank, I don't see many reefers follow the procedures accurately or read them uniformly. So the word accuracy, while it's strongly desired, really isn't the most realistic or important factor here. Consistency is the word of the day. I needed repeatable, consistent results. For instance, if my goal is 420, but at the end of the day I really had 410 or 430, it doesn't really matter. The only thing that really matters is if I did the test 3 times, I'd be pretty darn close each time. So in the spirit of that debate, I think the Hanna checkers are the tool that has been the most consistent for me with alkalinity and phosphate. I find sulfate, calcium, and magnesium to be the easiest to read for those tests, but Red Sea uses higher quality components, clear expiration dates for each individual reagent, and why I ultimately use Red Sea the most personally. That said, I have no reason to believe that one is more accurate than the other, and testing against each other is of near zero value. I will share that it's probably a good idea to have 2 tests around for something as critical as calcium and alkalinity, just in case you don't trust a number that you get. For trace elements, I think the only thing I'd personally consider is ICP. Hobby-grade minor and trace element kits are expensive, hard to perform, and really not all that accurate. As to is ICP testing really the best option? If you're running a method like full Triton method that relies on limited water changes or dosing a lot of trace elements, I'd probably send in an ICP test somewhat frequently. However, I think the value for ICP for most reefers is just a semi-annual or annual check on the tank's chemistry. Is what I'm doing working? If not, can I catch an issue before it materializes in corals losing tissue or mortality? While visual assessments of the tank are probably the most valuable, I'd consider the ICP test somewhat of a report card on what type of results your individual approach to reefing is producing, and often confirmation of a successful approach or a precursor to a challenge that you now can completely avoid. To be honest, most people really can't tell when something as complex and capable of feedback like a cat or dog is not healthy. If you have the ability to spot when a coral's unhealthy, you're part of the top 20%. If you can spot it before it's showing signs of extreme distress like losing tissue, polyp retraction, or loss of color, and actually fix the issue, you're part of the 5%. I guess I'd consider ICP testing not all that dissimilar from an annual visit to the vet and the blood work they do there. Now, not everyone does an annual vet visit, but at least you can understand the reason why somebody would send in an ICP test and the overall value, particularly as the monetary and emotional investment in the tank gets bigger and bigger. As to who produces the best ICP results, I can't really tell you. I know that if you send in multiple tests from different suppliers, you'll get different readings. This isn't an easy process to do in seawater, so the only thing I'll share is we trust Triton simply because they've been doing it the longest and had the ability to refine the process. Okay, so that said, what is the WWC approach to major, minor, and trace elements? Well, it's pretty simple. It's just large calcium reactors and 10 to 15% weekly water changes. Because they've had success with Kalkwasser early on and Kalkwasser is part of the team DNA, some of the tanks will do Kalkwasser in conjunction with calcium reactors for a pH benefit, but most of the tanks are calcium reactor only. So why calcium reactor? Well, in systems like a 500 or 900 gallon tank that's just jam-packed with corals, it's just the most economical solution, and because everyone there knows how to use them properly, they're also not considered complex. In fact, they consider the calcium reactors near set it and forget it and the simplest and stablest solution for managing major, minor, and trace elements on both of these large show systems. Related to that, they strongly believe that the calcium reactors are acceptable solutions for minor and trace elements. Going beyond that, with dosing bottles, it's only adding risk in both in terms of overdosing as well as just another thing that you have to remember to do constantly to maintain a stable system. In any case, you really can't deny the results, both in terms of what the tanks look like and the sheer number of coral frags they produce a month from these systems. There are hundreds of corals coming out of the 900 every single month. This is what success looks like. Okay, so where's the BRS team see the most successes? I gotta tell you, almost every tank here has been on BRS 2-part or Kalkwasser. I think A, because the BRS 2-part is obviously just built in the DNA around here. Almost every CS agent that works here has had a successful tank on BRS 2-part prior to coming here, and the DNA continues once they set up a new tank or share thoughts with others. No one's using a commercial 2-part with the included trace elements. But because we have mixed water on hand at all times, most of the team is good about regular water changes. The BRS 160 was on BRS 2-part and then went to Triton at one point. I will say the BRS 160 is still using Triton Core 7 because I do feel it's the best 2-part formulated for use with the refugium and don't feel like messing with success. But I will say after everything's said and done, I just find it easier to do water changes than send in tests. So we stopped following the Triton method exactly in preparation for the BRS WWC Hybrid series. Very few BRS team members are running calcium reactors. There are a couple exceptions to that. Randy ran a calcium reactor with a continuous duty dosing pump on his home tank, and I think his favorite solution. I think the rarity of calcium reactors isn't a lack of desire, but more so just a perception of the amount of work to tune and maintain them. I will say when we suggest coupled with a carbon doser which properly measures the CO2, a pH controller in the reactor, and a continuous duty dosing pump to control the flow, instantly the desire and willingness to run a reactor within the team is tenfold. And the only real question is, do I have the space? Since most of the office tanks here are around 60 gallons, it can be hard to fit some of them. Okay, so what is the BRS WWC hybrid method for trace, minor, and major elements? Well, just as a reminder, to meet WWC requirements, it needs to be simple and stable at all costs. Simple meaning two things. You don't have to be an electrical engineer or marine biologist to produce results, and no unnecessary equipment or complexities. Stable meaning three things. Equipment or additives are chosen based on reliability over features. Relies on time-tested proven methods, elimination of failure points, and over-reliance on technology. In relation to that, to meet the BRS requirements, the method needs to be applicable to a home or office environment, meaning that respects that reefers work, sleep, and travel, and we're frequently away from the tank, meaning an understanding that there isn't a team of trained professionals taking care of the tanks on a daily basis. We're also going to fulfill the commitment to building a hybrid system which will address a variety of budgets and skill levels almost anyone can follow and expect to achieve very similar results. In that spirit, we're going to attempt to offer an option where low cost is a priority, common option which is often that balance of cost and features, and a high-end option which often costs double or triple but comes with legit advantages for those that value or require them. So applying everything we discussed today, reviewing our own results as well as WWC's, I have no other choice that when everything is calculated, the calcium reactor is the simplest and most stable holistic approach. It is kind of fuzzy in an area I don't think everyone will agree with, but in the end, if you have a reliable way to fine-tune the flow through the reactor, a stable pH with the controlled CO2 inside the reactor, I feel compelled to agree with the WWC team that it's near a set it and forget it option, and there's no arguing with the type of results they're achieving, so I think the tie goes to the runner. To their statement, you don't need to be an electrical engineer or marine biologist to produce results and no unnecessary equipment or complexities. At first glance, a calcium reactor might seem like a clear violation, but listening to them talk about it, removing the trace element bottles, and fancy testing as well as chemistry issues related to 2-part and salinity in a high-demand tank, a calcium reactor absolutely reduces the need to be a marine biologist to produce results and removes unnecessary complexities. They just believe the calcium reactor is a necessary piece of equipment for their approach to results and properly train their team how to run them. However, staying true to offering options that will absolutely work in a variety of budget and skill levels, there's no way around it. BRS 2-part is one of the most cost-effective and most widely used solutions out there. And I actually think coupled with Tropic Marin's Part C, which is only a few bucks a gallon, it's still very affordable, but really meets a lot of desires from reefers to address trace elements in some manner. As to the higher end retail two parts, if I had to pick one for my own uses, I would pick the Triton one. It's not the most expensive, has a formula for standard takes called other methods, and a formula for refugiums with the standard core 7. Maintains minor and trace elements, and is a much more concentrated form which saves on space and maintenance, all legit advantages for a higher end option. So what exact gear do we use here for all three implementations, the XXL 750 Reefer, E-Series 170, and the BRS 160? Well, with the XXL 750, we went with the Varios CR200 8-inch DC calcium reactor, mostly because it's simple, and the Varios DC pump is both quiet and reliable. We'll absolutely be using a carbon doser to control the CO2 bubble rate and the pH control function on the apex to control the pH inside the reactor. I'd use whatever probe comes with your pH controller, but our choice is the BRS US-made lab-grade dual-junction pH probes because we want the highest degree of accuracy as well as longevity on the probes. And we'll be using the Chemours FX STP peristaltic continuous duty dosing pump to control the flow rate through the reactor precisely. Only difference with the BRS 160s, we'll be using the Vertex RX-C calcium reactor coupled with the same gear to tune and maintain the Vertex reactor. A couple nice things about the Vertex reactor is the pieces come off the mounting plate, which makes it nice for those tight spots underneath the stand. Comes with a solid C-shape pump, needle valve, flow meter, and additional chambers for other media types. Then with the E-Series 170, we're going to dose BRS 2-part coupled with Tropic Marin's Part C or the trace element component of the hybrid. All run off BRS dosers because of the lowest cost solution, which doses at a flow rate appropriate for 2 parts, particularly in a small tank like this one. So what are the levels that we're going to maintain as part of the hybrid system? Well, I see zero reason to not just go with what WWC shoots for with all their show tanks, an alkalinity of 8.6, calcium of 480, and mag of 1440. You might notice this is somewhat different than some of the recommendations out there, but the simple reason for that is stay away from extremes and leave room for mistakes. I know some reefers run an alkalinity of 7 because that's a bit closer to natural seawater, but it's also pretty close to numbers where a lot of us will see real issues if it drops below that. At 8.6, there's just room for the test kit, testing procedure to not be 100% perfect and for dosing errors to happen and still stay within safe zones. That about wraps up today's episode over on Reef to Reef. This week we're asking, what's best for an SPS dominant tank? A calcium reactor, 2-part Kalkwasser, or 1 parts like carbocalcium? If you have any questions on anything related to this, be on the lookout for when I go live every Monday at 3 p.m. Central and answer these questions in real time with a bit more in-depth thoughts and frank, uncut answers. You can just hit our channel at 3 p.m. and catch it, or subscribe and hit the notification bell to be instantly notified. It's also live on Facebook, so you can just like our page and under following, hit first to be notified. We can't hit on every question, so if you really need to know something specific about your tank, the best place to ask is the Facebook group #AskBRStv, where not only Randy and the team and myself answer these questions, but the BRS community really engages with each other with like-minded and friendly reefers. While the BRS team has a business hour, the entire BRS community often answers within minutes, which is an awesome tool. Lastly, no week is complete without giving away something away for free, so we're going to give away a Vertex calcium reactor, so hit that link in the lower left or head on over to the site and hit the free prizes link. See you next week with another episode of BRStv.